February 1st, 194320000 feet above Tunis, Tunisia, the sky was a sheet of frozen silver, streaked with contrails and the distant flashes of flak bursting like dark flowers. Through the oil-smeared plexiglass of his greenhouse canopy, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr., pilot of the B-17F All-American, watched his formation release their payloads over German U-boat pens below. It was supposed to be routine, another bombing run for the 97th Bomb Group, precise, methodical, the kind they had done a dozen times before, but on this morning, the routine would vanish in less than 90 minutes. Bragg's bomber flew steady in formation, engines droning, gauges steady, oxygen hissing through thin lines in the freezing cabin, nothing unusual. No warnings. No alarms. What Bragg couldn't see, high above the formation, was the faint silhouette of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, diving through the thin air at 300 miles per hour. Its pilot, already dead or unconscious, was no longer in control. The fighter had become a falling blade, 6,000 pounds of metal, fuel, and velocity tumbling toward the bombers below. A guided missile without guidance. Its path intersected perfectly with one aircraft, B-17F tail number 41-2446, call sign All-American. The collision was instantaneous, too fast for human perception. 1 heartbeat, the bomber was intact. The next, a sound like God-tearing sheet metal split the sky. The Messerschmitt's propeller and wing slammed through the bomber's rear fuselage, just behind the radio compartment. A spinning saw carving through aluminum skin, fragments of metal and fuel ignited in brief flashes before the wind tore them away. For a fraction of a second, the two aircraft became one, a violent, tangled sculpture of destruction. Before the fighter sheared away in pieces, inside the All-American, everything changed. A shudder ripped through the fuselage, followed by silence, an absence of vibration, of sound, that was somehow worse than the explosion. In the tail section, Staff Sergeant Tyrus Weaver felt the aircraft lurch violently. He reached for the intercom. Nothing, the line was dead. Oxygen hissed once, then stopped. The tube had been severed. He turned forward, and froze, through the swirling frost and drifting insulation. Weaver could see daylight, a gaping hole where the fuselage should have been. 8 feet of the aircraft were gone, torn completely away. The All-American had been almost cut in half. Only 3 structural longerons and a few control cables still connected the tail to the rest of the plane. Thin strands of aluminum holding together 40,000 pounds of flying metal. The bomber's back was broken. The tail section hung like a severed limb, twisting, trembling, ready to fall away. Every vibration, every gust of air threatened to finish the job. Gravity had begun. Up front, Bragg felt the change immediately. His instruments flickered, hydraulic pressure dropped to 0. The control yoke went soft, sluggish, unresponsive. He couldn't see behind him. He didn't yet know the full scale of the disaster, but the plane's trembling told him enough. Prepare to bail out. Bragg called over the intercom. His voice was calm, steady, a pilot's voice trained to sound unshakable when the world was collapsing. But in the shattered rear, Sergeant Weaver tried to move. He pulled at the tail escape hatch. It was jammed solid, the twisted frame locking it shut. He was trapped. A prisoner inside a dying section of aircraft 20,000 feet above enemy territory. Bragg's command came through the static once more. Bail out if you can. Weaver couldn't. Bragg understood what that meant. He looked at his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, and made a decision that defied every instinct of survival. We're not bailing out, he said, not while Weaver's still back there. The words hung in the cockpit, a promise, a defiance, a sentence. They would either bring the All-American home or die trying. Bragg steadied his hands on the controls, feeling the aircraft strain beneath him. He had no idea how much of it was left, but somehow, impossibly, the bomber was still flying. For the next 90 minutes, the All-American would become a legend, a crippled fortress that refused to fall, a machine that defied physics, and a pilot who refused to let go. Every second ahead would be a battle, not against the enemy, but against gravity itself. The formation of B-17s pressed on through thin, icy air. But one bomber, All-American, no longer looked like part of the squadron. It was barely an aircraft. Its tail hung at a sickening angle, the open wound in its fuselage flashing sunlight through twisted metal and shredded aluminum. The bomber's fate was sealed by every law of aerodynamics. It should have fallen apart minutes ago. Yet in the cockpit, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr. fought the controls with a quiet precision. The yoke felt soft, spongy, the mechanical linkages to the tail. Fluttering like torn nerves, every tiny movement risked structural failure, too much rudder, and the tail would twist free, too steep a bank, and centrifugal force could rip the last remaining longerons apart. Bragg's co-pilot, Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, leaned forward, scanning the engine gauges. .4 right Cyclone engine still roared, miraculously undamaged, but vibration had become their enemy. Any imbalance, any surge, could send oscillations through the fuselage, vibrations strong enough to finish what the collision started. Bragg's voice came through the intercom again, steady and clipped. Hold positions. Stay calm. No sudden movements. Behind him, the surviving crew members stared in horror through the jagged wound in the fuselage. Where the radio room had once been was now open sky, the thin blue horizon visible through torn aluminum. In the rear, Staff Sergeant Weaver waved faintly through drifting frost and wind, visible through a gap 8 feet wide. That he was alive, trapped, cut off by empty air. The crew could see him, but they couldn't reach him. A few cables, a few torn beams, that was all that linked him to the rest of the bomber. Every gust made the tail shudder violently. It flexed and groaned, the sound like a ship's hull straining in a storm. The All-American was a flying contradiction, a dead aircraft still clinging to life. Engineers would later say it was impossible. At this moment, it was reality. Bragg called into formation command. All-American damaged, holding altitude at 20,000 feet. The answer came: descend to nearest emergency strip. Bragg refused. Descending meant thicker air, greater pressure on the torn fuselage. He knew if he dropped below the cold, thin layer of high altitude, the denser air would tear the aircraft apart. He would keep her high. He would fly her home across 400 miles of air and hope that physics stayed merciful. Engel managed the throttles with surgical care. Too much power, and vibration, too little, and they would lose lift. It was a balance between motion and collapse. In the waist section, the gunners stared into the open sky behind them. Wine screamed through the wreckage. The smell of burnt oil and hydraulic fluid filled the compartment. Sergeant Robert G. Leftwich, the waist gunner, later recalled, you could see Weaver back there, sitting in his section, waving, just waiting. There was nothing we could do. He was alive, but it felt like watching someone already gone. Above them, sunlight flashed off distant Messerschmitts, enemy fighters circling the sky. The All-American was an easy kill, a wounded fortress limping alone, but the German fighters didn't attack. Maybe they were out of ammunition, maybe they simply watched, realizing they were witnessing something beyond combat, a machine refusing to die. For the men inside, time dissolved into slow motion. Each minute stretched into eternity. Each vibration sounded like the beginning of the end. The intercom hissed with static. Engel adjusted the propeller pitch manually, easing strain on the airframe. Bragg kept both hands on the yoke, breathing in rhythm with the shuddering aircraft. Every movement of his wrist had to be calculated, gentle, smooth, never abrupt. He was no longer flying a bomber. He was balancing a broken body on the edge of death. Outside, the Mediterranean shimmered below them, blue, silent, indifferent. The bomber's shadow flickered over clouds that moved like slow smoke. And the tail. Weaver watched the torn skin of the fuselage flex like paper. He could see daylight through the fractures. He could even see the cables, his lifelines, quivering under tension. He thought of cutting loose, of jumping, but there was no space to crawl forward, and the hatch was still jammed tight. The tail section had become his coffin in the sky. Over the next 30 minutes, Bragg made small adjustments, shifting trim tabs, testing controls. Each minor correction bought them a few more seconds of survival. Flak bursts still dotted the distant horizon, but the worst threat was invisible, air itself. At 200 miles per hour, every gust pressed against the damaged tail like a hammer blow. In the co-pilot seat, Engel whispered a single line: if the tail goes, we all go. Bragg didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the instruments, watching the fragile balance of altitude, speed, and vibration that meant life or death. He flew as if his hands were made of glass. Every second demanded perfect precision, a test of human control against mechanical ruin. And slowly, miraculously, the All-American held together. The airframe groaned, the tail quivered, but the cables, those few remaining veins of metal, did not snap. Somehow, against every probability, they were still flying. To the crew, it felt like time itself had stopped. 90 minutes stretched across eternity, each heartbeat an act of defiance. They were no longer fighting a war, they were fighting gravity itself. And at the center of it all, Bragg, calm, focused, his face streaked with frost and sweat, that a pilot holding together what engineering said should not exist. Far below, the African coast shimmered faintly through haze. Still hundreds of miles away, it looked close enough to reach, yet impossibly far. The radio crackled again. Formation command, all American, report status. Bragg's reply was short, even, still airborne. No one in the formation believed it, but from a distance, they could see the crippled bomber still maintaining formation speed, its tail section fluttering like a flag in the jet stream. What was once a flying fortress was now a symbol of defiance, a living contradiction. Every second in the air was a victory. Bragg knew one thing: if they made it home, it would not be because of luck, it would be because of control. Every ounce of strength, patience, and calculation his body could give, the mission that began as routine was now something else entirely, a slow-motion miracle unfolding over the Mediterranean sky. The All-American was still in the sky, barely. Below, the Mediterranean stretched to the horizon, endless blue beneath the shattered fuselage. Each vibration, each gust, threatened to finish the job that German steel had started. Inside the cockpit, the air had grown quiet. No one spoke. Every man listened for the next sound that might mean the end. Metal groaned and flexed behind them like a wounded animal. Bragg's gloved hand stayed frozen to the yoke. His muscles had begun to cramp, but he didn't dare adjust. Every movement had to be slow, deliberate. Any sudden change could twist the tail free. The All-American was now over the Gulf of Tunis, halfway home. Fuel consumption was steady, but time wasn't on their side. That if they couldn't hold altitude, they'd never reach Biskra. Lieutenant Engel adjusted the trim again. The cable snapped tight, then relaxed. A reminder that the control system was hanging on by threads. In the waist, Sergeant Leftwich and Sergeant Reynolds had taken up a grim task. Watching the tail for signs of failure. Every 30 seconds, one would shout over the intercom, "Tail still on." It became a ritual of survival. In the rear, Staff Sergeant Weaver remained cut off, trapped in the separated tail. He had tied himself down with a length of parachute cord, bracing against the shuddering fuselage. Wind howled through the cracks, frost formed on his jacket. He knew the truth. One more violent shake, and his section could shear away completely. He had stopped speaking on the intercom. Now, he simply stared forward, waiting. The rest of the crew refused to look back anymore. They couldn't bear to watch him through that torn hole, alive, isolated, beyond help. Bragg checked the compass. Slight drift to the east. He corrected gently. The bomber obeyed, just enough to stay on course. Then, turbulence. A wave of air rolled up from the sea, unseen, unstoppable. The bomber lurched, metal screamed, the entire rear section twisted, the tail flexing nearly 3 feet from center. Every man froze. Bragg's heart stopped for a second, then his training took over. He eased the yoke left, countering the torque, feeding just enough throttle to stabilize. The plane leveled, the tail, unbelievably, held. The crew broke into shaky laughter, the kind born from shock more than relief. They had survived another invisible blow, but Bragg knew something had changed. The controls felt softer now, slower to respond. Something critical had loosened. He radioed formation lead. "This is All-American. Still airborne. Structural integrity unknown. Requesting escort to base." The lead bomber turned back, taking position off Bragg's wing. From the air, they could finally see the full extent of the damage, the tail section hanging by 2 narrow spars, daylight visible clean through the fuselage. The lead pilot radioed back, disbelief in his voice. "My God, Bragg, half your plane's gone." Bragg didn't reply. He was too focused on the horizon, the faint shape of land emerging through haze. Africa. For the first time in an hour and a half, the men began to believe they might make it. But the hardest part still lay ahead. Landing. B-17 needed full elevator control for touchdown, a luxury they no longer had. Their tail was crippled. The elevators barely connected. If the airframe twisted on approach, the bomber would disintegrate before it even reached the ground. Engel recalculated. Fuel, they had enough for 1 attempt, maybe 2, if they risked circling. Bragg nodded silently. He already knew. There would only be one. They crossed the coastline at 12,000 feet. The African desert opened below them, gold and red under the afternoon sun. Radio towers from Biskra airfield appeared in the distance, faint against the shimmering horizon. Home was close enough to see, but could they reach it? The ground control operator at Biskra responded immediately. "All-American, you are clear for emergency landing. Field is ready. Medic standing by." The base commander and engineers gathered near the runway, scanning the distant sky with binoculars. At first, they saw only a speck, one of dozens returning from mission. Then they realized something was wrong. One of the aircraft was broken open, its tail hanging like torn paper. It was a sight no one in aviation had ever seen before. Inside the All-American, oxygen was running low. The crew had removed their masks to conserve what was left, their breath frosting in the thin air. Bragg turned slightly toward Engel, his voice was hoarse, almost calm. "We'll bring her in straight. No sharp turns. If the tail goes, we go." Engel nodded, his eyes fixed on the airspeed indicator, 180 miles per hour and dropping slowly. The bomber began its long, trembling descent toward Biskra. For 90 minutes, they had fought physics. Now, they had to defy gravity one last time. The crew braced themselves. Weaver, in the tail, crossed his arms and closed his eyes. He couldn't see the runway. He could only feel the trembling of the metal beneath him. The dying heartbeat of the All-American. Down below, engineers and ground personnel watched in stunned silence as the crippled bomber lined up for approach. No one believed it could make a controlled landing. Every pilot on the ground whispered the same words: "It's impossible." Bragg's hands tightened on the yoke. The runway shimmered ahead, long, flat, and waiting. This was the final test, the last few minutes that would decide whether the story of the All-American ended in the desert, or in history. The desert wind was still, the sun hung low over the airstrip, glinting off sheets of corrugated steel and rows of waiting medics. Every eye on the ground was turned upward, toward a distant sound that did not belong to any normal flight. A heavy drone, uneven, ragged, echoed across the base. Then, through the heat shimmer, the shape appeared, the All-American, or what was left of her, half her tail gone. The rear fuselage peeled open like a broken shell. A long trail of exhaust marked her path as she limped toward the field, the impossible made visible. On the control tower balcony, the base commander lowered his binoculars slowly. He said nothing. No words could explain what he was seeing. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Kendrick, Sonny Bragg Jr. was locked in total focus. Sweat ran down his face in thin streaks beneath his oxygen mask. The yoke trembled in his hands, light, fragile, as if connected to nothing. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, whispered the final checklist: "Gear down." Bragg hesitated. Dropping the gear could shake the fuselage apart. He eased the lever anyway. Hydraulic pressure groaned through the crippled system. The landing gear began to extend, painfully slow. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a metallic thud. Locked, against all odds, both wheels were down. Behind them, the crew braced in silence. Some gripped their parachutes, others stared at the open wound where the radio room had once been. There was nowhere to run if the airframe gave way. Bragg's voice came through the intercom, calm and even: "We'll bring her straight in. No flare, no banking. Hold steady." At 2,000 feet, the bomber hit a crosswind. The tail swayed, a slow, dangerous arc. The entire rear structure flexed violently. Bragg adjusted instantly, using only a fraction of elevator control. What little remained connected by shredded cables. Engel feathered the two outer engines, slowing descent. The ground rose fast. They were seconds from impact. From the tower, the All-American looked like it was falling apart midair, every panel trembling, every joint screaming, but somehow, the bomber held alignment. Bragg's voice was barely audible: "Hold her, hold her." He eased back the throttles, the airspeed dropped, 140 mph. The field stretched out ahead like a lifeline. Then, contact. The B-17 hit the runway hard, sparks flashing beneath its wheels. A sickening groan filled the air as the fuselage twisted on impact. Every man inside felt the floor buckle beneath his boots. But Bragg didn't release the yoke. He held it tight, guiding the bomber down the strip as it shuddered violently. The tail dragged, metal scraping asphalt, sending a trail of sparks behind them. The right gear collapsed, then locked again. It was no longer landing, it was surviving its own descent. Bragg shouted, "Cut power." Engel throttled down, the roaring engines dropped to a low whine. For a moment, the bomber slid sideways, its torn fuselage groaning like bending steel. Dust exploded across the runway. Then, stillness. The All-American stopped. Point one while buried in sand, tail hanging inches from collapse. Silence, the kind that comes after death. But this time, it was the sound of survival. Bragg sat motionless, his fingers still clenched around the yoke, white with strain. He whispered the same word twice, barely audible over the wind: "We're down." Engel exhaled for the first time in 90 minutes that he turned toward the back, but where there should have been the radio room, there was only open daylight that he could see Staff Sergeant Weaver in the tail, motionless, eyes open, staring forward. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Weaver lifted his arm and waved weakly. Cheers erupted inside the bomber. Hoarse, exhausted, unbelieving, every man on board was alive. Ground crews rushed forward, medics, engineers, and mechanics surrounded the aircraft, shouting over each other, but none of them dared touch it. One wrong move and the tail might collapse completely. The base commander approached slowly, staring at the wreckage. He had seen bombers return with holes, fire, missing engines, but never like this. The All-American's tail was attached by two narrow metal beams, each bent, half sheared, from side to side. Daylight poured through the open midsection. It was a miracle that the airframe had not torn apart in the sky, when they finally lifted Weaver out of the tail. He laughed weakly and said, "Didn't think I'd get a ride this rough for free." Engineers circled the bomber, touching the jagged metal in disbelief. They had seen diagrams of stress failure, test models in wind tunnels, but this was beyond science. The All-American stood as if stitched together by invisible hands. No rivet, no weld could have explained it, only luck, and Bragg's precision. Over the next hour, mechanics reinforced the fuselage with temporary braces. Photographers captured every angle, the torn aluminum, the exposed frame, the gap where daylight ran straight through. Those photos would later circle the world, shocking engineers at Boeing. They declared the flight aerodynamically impossible. But for the crew of the All-American, the impossible had a name. It was the bond of 10 men who refused to give up, and a pilot who believed that even half a bomber was still worth flying home. As night fell over Biskra, the All-American rested silently on the sand. The desert wind whistled through her wounds, carrying with it the sound of survival. Every man on the base who saw her that evening knew they had witnessed something history would never forget. February 2, 1943. The morning after the landing, silence hung over the base. The desert air was still, cold, carrying the faint smell of oil and sand. In the first light of dawn, the All-American stood alone on the edge of the airstrip, a ghost of aluminum and steel, resting against the wind. She looked less like a bomber and more like a carcass. The rear fuselage was twisted and open, daylight spilling straight through the middle, yet somehow, she remained upright, balanced, fragile, and impossibly whole. Engineers surrounded her with cameras and measuring tools, their boots crunching on the sand. They spoke in hushed tones, disbelief echoing in every word. "It shouldn't have stayed together," one said, "not for a minute. Not for 90. The base commander arrived shortly after sunrise. He walked slowly around the aircraft, running his hand along the torn metal. He stopped near the midsection, where the fuselage had been nearly severed clean through. Sunlight streamed through the open space like a scar of light. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet: "Get photographs. Every angle. The world needs to see this." At 8 o'clock hours, photographers from the 414th Bomb Squadron arrived with heavy Graflex cameras. They began documenting the wreck, the open midsection, the shredded tail, the fractured spars that somehow refused to break. One image captured what words could not: the All-American sitting on the sand, her rear fuselage drooping but intact. A clean beam of desert sunlight cutting straight through her middle. It looked like an illusion, but it was real. Inside the maintenance hangar, Lieutenant Bragg, Engel, and the crew sat in silence. Medics had checked them for injuries, only bruises, frostbite, and exhaustion, but the real weight was invisible, the memory of 90 minutes in a dying machine. When asked how they managed to keep her flying, Bragg simply said, "You just hold her steady, and pray she holds you back." His words spread through the base like wildfire. Mechanics repeated them, pilots quoted them, and soon they reached headquarters. By afternoon, telegrams were already flying toward Allied command. A bomber, nearly cut in half, had flown 300 miles and landed safely with all crew alive. It was the kind of headline that didn't belong to war, but to legend. Engineers from the 97th Bomb Group began an official inspection. They measured every tear, every fractured beam. Their conclusion was simple and haunting. By all known principles of flight, the All-American should have disintegrated in the air. The vertical stabilizer had only 2 spars left. The control cables were severed in 3 places, held together by friction and strands of wire, and yet, the structure had survived because of a strange twist. Literally, the collision had bent the fuselage in such a way that the metal locked into itself, forming a crude brace that it was accidental engineering, luck born of destruction. Photographs were developed in the base darkroom that afternoon. Each frame revealed the same impossible image, a B-17. Still intact despite a missing third of its structure, those photos would soon travel across the Atlantic, to the engineers at Boeing in Seattle. When they saw them, disbelief turned into reverence. One designer simply said, "That plane should be in pieces." Instead, she's teaching us something new. Back in Algeria, Bragg and his crew stood beside their bomber as more officers arrived to witness the miracle. They pointed, measured, shook their heads, but no one could explain it. One officer remarked, "You didn't fly a B-17. You flew a prayer." That night, the crew gathered quietly near the hangars. They shared cigarettes in silence, the kind that only men who'd walked the edge understand. Weaver, the tail gunner who had been trapped for the entire flight, spoke softly, "When it hit us, I thought that was it. I saw daylight where the radio room used to be. But I looked up front, and we were still flying. I figured as long as we were moving, I'd keep shooting." The others laughed, tired, hollow laughter that came from somewhere deeper than relief. They all knew how close it had been. 2 days later, All-American was declared unfit for further combat. Her structure was too damaged to repair, but she would not be scrapped immediately. The Army wanted her photographed, documented, remembered. She became a teaching tool for engineers, a symbol of what a B-17 could endure, and what a pilot's hands could control under impossible conditions. The photographs reached Stars and Stripes within weeks. Soon after, they appeared in American newspapers, under headlines like "Flying Fortress Returns," "Half a Plane, All Heart." For the public, it was a miracle story, a spark of hope amid the relentless attrition of war. For those who had flown her, it was something else entirely. A reminder that survival often had nothing to do with luck, and everything to do with discipline, training, and courage. At Biskra, pilots began referring to her as the fortress that refused to die. Others simply called her the ghost ship. Bragg and Engel both received commendations for their actions, though neither man spoke much about the flight. When asked years later, Bragg only said, "We did our job. The plane did hers. That's all." But for everyone who saw her, the All-American remained more than just an aircraft. She was proof that sometimes, in war, even machines have willpower. Her twisted frame stayed at Biskra for several months before finally being dismantled, yet her legend, the image of a bomber nearly torn in half flying itself home, would endure for generations. And though the All-American would never fly again, her story already had. Across airfields, classrooms, and mess halls, men would whisper about the day a flying fortress defied gravity itself. February 3, 1943, Biskra Airfield, Algeria. The desert sun climbed over the horizon like a flare rising through smoke. At the far end of the runway, what remained of the B-17F All-American sat in silence. Her mission log was closed. Her engines would never turn again, but her story was just beginning. Engineers from Boeing arrived 2 days later, men in grease-stained coveralls and thick spectacles, stepping off a C-47 transport with notebooks and calipers. They walked toward the wreckage with a kind of reverence, as though approaching a monument rather than a machine. When they saw the gap in the fuselage, nearly 8 feet of daylight between the forward and rear sections, they stopped speaking entirely. One of them finally murmured, "This should not be standing. Not even on the ground." They began their inspection in silence. Every severed long run, every bent spar, every shredded cable told the same story: survival by inches. The damage report stretched into hundreds of entries. 2 main structural members, gone completely. A third, fractured through. Only one, the right-hand long run, had remained intact enough to carry the full load of the tail. The engineers compared photographs, ran calculations on paper, and drew diagrams across the hangar walls. Again and again, the math came back the same. Flight was impossible, yet, for 90 minutes, impossibility had flown. Their final statement read like a confession: "The fact that this aircraft remained airborne and under control represents a statistical impossibility." The skill of the pilot and the structural redundancy of the B-17 combined to achieve what mathematics says cannot occur. That single line would echo across the Army Air Forces, a sentence that blurred the boundary between engineering and faith. when the photographs reached the United States, Boeing engineers gathered in Seattle to study them. They enlarged the prints, tracing every fracture, every torn panel. One veteran designer, who had helped shape the B-17 years earlier, whispered, "We built her to take punishment. But we never dreamed she could take that." For the men who flew bombers across Europe and North Africa, the photographs became more than evidence. They were talismans, pinned inside cockpits and briefing rooms. The image of all-American reminded crews that even in ruin, a flying fortress could still come home. In German POW camps, the photos circulated through the barbed wire fences. Captured Luftwaffe pilots stared at them in disbelief. Some insisted the pictures were fakes. Allied propaganda. No aircraft could survive that kind of wound. When American guards confirmed the images were real, the reaction was telling. One German pilot looked at the photographs, shook his head, and said quietly, "This is why you will win. You build machines that refuse to die." Back in Algeria, All American was stripped for salvage, her usable parts, the engines, radios, and undamaged instruments, were removed to repair other bombers. Her broken frame was left under the desert sun, slowly fading into dust and legend. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The official citation was brief, for extraordinary achievement while serving as pilot of a B-17 aircraft on a bombing mission over enemy territory. When his aircraft was severely damaged by collision, Lieutenant Bragg displayed exceptional airmanship in flying the crippled bomber to a safe landing, saving the lives of his entire crew. It did not mention the 90 minutes of terror. It did not describe the silence between every heartbeat at 20,000 feet. It simply recorded a fact: one bomber, one pilot, 9 lives saved. To those who knew the truth, that simplicity made the story even more powerful, because behind those few lines lived a story of control, courage, and impossible precision. Bragg never saw himself as a hero. He deflected praise to his crew, to his co-pilot, Godfrey Engel, and to Staff Sergeant Tyrus Weaver, who had been trapped in the tail section for nearly 2 hours. The plane held together because it was built right, Bragg would say. We just kept her steady. But the men who had flown with him knew otherwise. They had seen what hands of steel and nerves of ice could do against the laws of physics. The story of All American spread through every base in North Africa, across England, and into the halls of the Pentagon. It became an unofficial legend, whispered in mess halls, quoted in briefings, remembered by every crew who ever doubted they could make it home. By mid-1943, Boeing engineers had already begun integrating what they learned from the wreckage into later B-17 variants, reinforced spars, extra load paths, stronger fuselage bracing. Every improvement traced its lineage back to that February flight. The lessons from All American would ripple through time, shaping not just the rest of the war, but the future of aviation itself. After the war, Bragg returned home quietly. He rarely spoke of the mission, and when he did, it was only in passing. He lived a long life, modest, private, content to let the legend belong to the airplane instead of himself. When asked, years later, what he remembered most from that day, Bragg paused for a long moment before replying: the silence. When the tail was hit, and the intercom went dead. That silence. You never forget it. Photographs of All American now hang in aviation museums across the world. They show a machine that looks too broken to have ever flown, yet somehow, she did. Each photo carries the same unspoken message: courage and craftsmanship, together, can defy gravity itself. For the men who flew the Flying Fortress, All American became more than a story. She was proof. Proof that when the world says, impossible, there is always one crew willing to try anyway. And so, decades later, her name still carries weight among aviators and historians alike, not for her victories, not for the missions she completed, but for the single flight where she refused to fall. 3 damaged longerons. A handful of control cables. 90 minutes of perfect flying. 1 crew brought home alive. Engineers said it was impossible. The photographs proved it happened, and somewhere between mathematics and miracles, between the science of flight and the spirit of survival, lived the story of a bomber that would not die. She was called All American, and she remains, even now, the embodiment of what it means to endure.